So have you ever looked at your life and realized that a rule someone else gave you made you suffer, or caused you to lose years, or made you into a person that you didn't consciously choose to become? I'm going to be sharing two stories to illustrate this fact and to help us think about how blind obedience, to authority figures, especially but not limited to, religious context, may be contributing to suffering. Now, one of these stories is personal, while the other happened to someone I know. I would start with the story of the person I know. Now, growing up, I grew up to and knew my dad to have this friend who was unmarried and attended a particular church, right? And from when I was a child up until when I got admission into university, this man, who is my dad's age mate or maybe older or a bit younger, always used to come visit us in the house. So I knew him as my dad's friend, and every time we come back home anytime I come back home for holidays, I would always, ask about him and, just generally ask to get updated on gist. And so, like I said, I'd known this man from my childhood when I was a baby up until when I got admission into the university. And by the time I graduated from the university and came back home, as usual, you ask family members for gist on this person and that person. And I remember hearing that he had gotten married, right? And I was like, wow, I'm happy for him. I didn't know he was still interested in marriage. And that's when I got a download of what really happened with this man. Now, it turns out that this man, who is my dad's age mate, attends this church where when a young man finds a lady he fancies or is interested in, he can't approach the lady by himself, right? You have to go tell the pastor or a minister or somebody, who then approaches the girl, speaks to the girl and sort of vets her, right? Now, when he vets her, he comes back to you with a feedback to either say, yes, from my spiritual position and experienced assessment, she's a good fit for you, so you guys can marry. And so the guy can now start talking to the lady with a chaperone, or I don't know if that's what's called. Somebody will be there when they meet, and every time they have to meet to discuss and get to know each other, there has to be a third person there. Now, on the occasion that the minister or the auditor of this lady vets her and feels that either he was ministered to by the spirit and was told that this lady is not going to be a good match for this guy, the guy doesn't approach the lady, and so he has to go start looking for somebody else, because apparently that's not the will of God. Now, from what I was told, right, this happened numerous times, and based on the standard of that particular denomination and denomination of the Christian religion, right, he didn't have access to a wide group of women that the church would have accepted, and so he had very limited women to pick from. And going through the barrier of the limitation of having very little women to pick from, and then having to cross another hurdle of a minister auditing this person you are interested in, sort of elongated his whole journey. And because he wanted to be compliant with the doctrines of the church, right, he stuck to it and didn't step out of those doctrine and the boundaries of the doctrine. Now, imagine my surprise when I came back home and they were telling me that he got a lady pregnant, and that he's currently his first child is in nursery school, right? He got a lady pregnant, had to marry her, and at that age, when my dad, who is his age mate's first child, was graduating from the university, he had to be figuring out nursery school runs, things that he would have done a long time ago. And to even make matters worse, it's almost as though he couldn't continue with the high standard and the unrealistic demand for obedience and their vetting process that he had to, should I say, fall into temptation and impregnate somebody who he eventually married at a late age. Now, the way I see it when I think about this story, right, this man's greatest undoing or his wrongdoing was obedience. What is so demanded continuously and consistently from religious spaces and religious authorities, obedience, and he gave it so much so that it cost him years and years and years of his life, such that a task or an experience or a duty that maybe he should have performed much in his past when he was, much younger and energetic, he was now having to bear the consequences and do it at an old age. And the very sad thing for me from this story is that when a system demands, so much obedience and compliance to the extent that it takes away your capacity to make personal decisions that concerns your life, it sort of replaces your God-given agency, your God-given instincts, your God-given wisdom with institutional context and, frameworks that would not always serve your best interest. Now, the second story is personal to me, right? I also grew up within another denomination, and in that denomination, we were taught that wearing trousers is a bad thing, right? It's a sin against God, because evidently God had said a man should not wear what belongs to a woman and a woman should not wear what belongs to a man. But let me give you some context. We grew up in Plateau State, Jos, Nigeria, and if you know Jos very well, sometimes the temperature gets as cold as 10, 11, 14 degrees Celsius, and that's quite cold. And in the neighborhood where I grew up, right, there's usually no water in the neighborhood, so people wake up as early as 4:30, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock to go to distant places to go look for water. And you know that in the early hours of that morning, the cold is sort of heightened because there's no sun light yet, and so those are just like heightened periods of when the cold is out. Now, in my household, in the household where I was raised and where I was brought up, women couldn't wear trousers, and so it was still part of our responsibility as women, as girls, including the guys, to go out that early in the morning to go source for water. Because bear in mind that if you don't go out early, other households will go and fetch all the water from the well, right? And by the time you get there, there is no more water, so the water sort of gathers overnight, and then the first family to get there sort of gets the water from the well, right? So most families try to, it was like a competition of who would go there first with the most number of family members to gather the water. And so in those early hours of the morning, right, I, as a girl, also first daughter, I always used to lead. I would wake my siblings up for us to go get the water. And the boys will wear their trousers, sometimes they will double it, and then we girls, all we had to do was maybe wear a gown, tie a wrapper, and maybe double the gown, and then wear socks, right? But still, the cold will get to you compared to somebody who is wearing trousers and double trousers. And many times I would approach my dad and say, please, can we wear trousers even if it's to sleep in the night because there is cold? And the response would be, didn't you see it in the Bible where God said a man should not wear what belongs to a woman? And I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that, so does that mean God wants cold to kill me? Does that mean God likes men more than women? Because I'm in Jos. The weather is cold. I used to, even till date, I react to cold so much that it feels as though my bones are frozen. And I would beg my dad, like, can we wear trousers even if it's to sleep? And my dad forbade it because he would not allow us to sin against God under his leadership. Now, this is somebody who he wears as much as double trousers, and he even wear a track suit to protect himself from the cold. But we ladies, that's our cross. That's what the Lord commanded, that we shouldn't wear trousers. And so the material that we had to wear, even though it was not sufficient and fitting enough to protect us from the cold, we had to make do with it like that and bear the consequences of the biting cold just to obey the commandment of God, even though it felt unfair. It's like an erosion of empathy, erode sympathy, erode human dignity, just to stick to a doctrine, even if somebody was being affected by it. All this holistic consumption of doctrines without context, holistic obedience without nuances, when the rule seems to matter more than the people suffering under it, and the religion begins to consume you rather than work for your benefit or benefit you. Now, this is not just even about the Nigerian context, even though I'm using the Nigerian context as an example. You can extrapolate this to anywhere in the world and see how people are held captives by blind obedience, religion, and practices that sort of erode our empathy, our sympathy, our human compassion, right? In the name of blind obedience, followership. In the name of blind obedience and followership. And my aim here is to call your attention if you are still held back by such blind obedience, by fear, the fear that God will punish you for disobeying. The shame, because shame is also a component of it. What will people say if I act based on my own intelligence and my own agency? Conformity and dependency on other people to sort of interpret what God is and who God is to you. And my challenge to you today is to let yourself utilize the agency, the independence, and the intelligence that God has given you, even within religion, if you are still practicing any faith. Be able to ask the hard questions. Don't run away from it. Don't buy into the fear of God will punish you. Who are you to question God? Ask critical questions like, who does this rule serve? Ask critical questions like, is this what God said, or is this a denominational rule? Be able to separate the divine from your denomination. Notice the places, the instances where religion or beliefs require you to shrink and become a smaller person. Because I always used to wonder, why is it being communicated sometimes like God wants me to be so small and so fearful and not live freely? Notice where religion asks you to shrink, and give yourself the permission to feel all contradictions, to embrace nuances, and to think and use your own God-given wisdom of what is the best way to tackle or address a situation, rather than blindly following a doctrine that you can evidently see is making people suffer and waste their life and agonize for years and years and years on end. And lastly, I want you to ask yourself this question: what has blind obedience cost you? What has it cost you in joy, in opportunities, in living a full life? What has it even cost you in your own body? And again, I'll leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein, that blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Think about it today and allow your mind break the barriers of blind obedience that has been demanded of you, that has kept you limited. I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye.